The ceramic plates of the rank insignia hit the deck plating with a sharp, hollow clatter. It was a small sound, but in the pressurized silence of the Aegis Prime's command deck, it rang like a gunshot. Elias Thorne didn't wait for the Praetor's reaction. He didn't need to see the twitch in Vex's secondary set of eyes or hear the hiss of the alien's respiratory filters. The heaviest weight a soldier carries is the armor he no longer believes in, and for Elias, the weight had finally become bone-crushing. He turned his back on the command seat, his boots heavy on the metal floor. Behind him, the Praetor's voice was a cold, clicking rasp, translated through a box that stripped away even the hint of empathy. You are walking away from your purpose, Thorne. Humans are nothing but disposable biological weapons. You were built to be the blade of the Coalition. To break is to be discarded. Elias stopped, but he didn't turn around. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, just a little. The skin was stained with the gray, clinging ash of Azura Reach, the dust of a world that had been turned into a graveyard while the Coalition watched from the safety of high orbit. He remembered the heat of the atmospheric fire. He remembered the way the comms went silent, one by one, as his squad was ground into the mud. In fact, the decision hadn't been made here, in this sterile room. It had been made 3 days ago, when he'd looked into the visor of a dying corporal and realized that they weren't being led. They were being spent. Truth is, the Coalition didn't want allies. They wanted tools that didn't talk back. The transit to Aurora station was a blur of cramped freighter bunks and the sour smell of low-grade recycled air. It was a civilian outpost, a jagged collection of pressurized modules clinging to a frozen moon on the edge of the frontier. It was the kind of place where people went to be forgotten, where the rules of the High Command were just muffled noise on a dying radio. Elias found work in the lower docks, a place where the walls were slick with condensation and the hum of the life support was a constant, uneven throb. He spent his days hauling freight and his nights staring at the scarred metal of his locker. He'd stripped the rank, but the soldier was harder to shed. His muscles still tensed at every sudden clang of a docking clamp. His eyes still searched for exits in every room. Ironically, it was the silence that hurt the most. On the Aegis Prime, there was always an order to follow, a target to hit, a reason to bleed. Here, there was only the cold and the slow, grinding work of survival. He was free, but freedom felt a lot like being hollow. He watched the civilian haulers, come and go men and women who flew ships held together by prayer and luck. They were messy, loud, and disorganized, and they were exactly what he needed to see. One evening, while he was cleaning a clogged fuel line, a shadow fell across his workbench. It was an old hauler named Sarah, her face a map of radiation burns and hard miles. She didn't ask about his past. Nobody did on Aurora. She just pointed at a leaking coolant manifold on her ship. "Can you fix it?" she asked, her voice raspy from too much bad air. Elias looked at her, then at the ship a battered old bird called the Wayward Sun. It wasn't a weapon. It was a home. "I can try," he said. That was the first time he'd used his hands for something other than a trigger in 10 years. It was a small spark, a tiny shift in the gravity of his life. He wasn't a weapon of the Coalition anymore. He was just a man with a wrench, trying to keep the dark at bay. But the dark was coming for them all, and it wouldn't care about his retirement. The Wayward Sun shuddered as a kinetic slud tore through the port stabilization fin. Elias gripped the manual flight sticks, his knuckles white against the greasy plastic. Outside the viewport, the Siderian atmosphere was a churning mess of purple clouds and green plasma fire. The void-born swarm was a carpet of black chitin and jagged metal, closing in on the last orbital elevator. They weren't fighting a war, they were harvesting a species, and Elias was leading a fleet of garbage trucks into the mouth of the beast. It had started with a low-frequency pulse that shook the foundations of Aurora Station, a Siderian distress signal. The Coalition's response had been a cold, calculated silence. The Siderians weren't strategic assets, they were just people. When the news hit the docks, Elias saw the look in the hauler's eyes. It wasn't fear, it was a recognition of the same abandonment they all felt. He stood on a shipping crate in the central hub, his voice carrying over the sound of failing scrubbers. "We are not the weapons of the Coalition," he told them, his eyes locking onto Sarah's. "We are the architects of their survival. They didn't have railguns, they didn't have shields, but they had industrial mining lasers and 5-ton cargo containers filled with unstable fuel slurry. They had grit and a sudden burning need to prove that their lives weren't just entries on a Praetor spreadsheet. Now, in the thick of the swarm, the plan was simple and suicidal. Push the throttle, Sarah yelled from the engineering crawlspace. "The heat's melting the seals." Elias slammed the levers forward. The wayward sun groaned, its frame twisting under the G-force. He wasn't thinking about rank or medals. He was thinking about the vibration of the deck under his boots, and the fact that Sarah had trusted him to fly her home. Truth is, the Coalition's perfect formations were useless here. The haulers flew like drunken flies, erratic, unpredictable, and dangerous. They dumped their cargo loads directly into the path of the swarm, detonating the fuel tanks with mining lasers. The vacuum of space lit up with jagged orange blossoms of fire. It was messy. It was desperate. It worked. "An ally by choice is worth 10,000 soldiers by command," Elias whispered as he watched the swarm's line fracture. The Voidborn weren't used to enemies that fought without logic, that threw their own livelihoods into the fire just to save a stranger. By the time the Aegis Prime finally decloaked on the edge of the system, the siege was broken. The Siderian capital was scarred, but standing. Elias sat in the cockpit of the smoking, battered Wayward Sun as the Coalition shuttle docked. Praetor Vex stepped out, his tall, spindly frame draped in the same pristine armor Elias had discarded. The alien's eyes scanned the ragtag fleet of dented freighters. "Your tactics were unconventional, Thorn," Vex said, the translator box buzzing. "But effective. Your commission is reinstated. You will return to the Aegis Prime at once." Elias wiped a smear of hydraulic fluid from his forehead. He looked at Sarah, who was leaning against the bulkhead, her hand on the hull of her ship. He looked at the Siderian ships rising from the planet below, not as subjects, but as survivors who owed their lives to the disposable ones. "No," Elias said. Vex's eyes narrowed. "You refuse? Without the Coalition, you are nothing. You are a civilian in a galaxy that eats the weak." Ironically, Elias smiled. "Then we'll just have to be a little harder to swallow." He turned away from the Praetor, walking toward the group of haulers waiting on the dock. They didn't need a command structure. They didn't need a flag. They just needed each other. The Free Legions wouldn't fight for a border or a throne. They would fight because they chose to. He didn't look back at the Aegis Prime as it burned its engines to leave. He had a manifold to fix, and for the first time in his life he knew exactly who he was working for. "Would you like me to write a new story based on a different set of genres or a different character's perspective?"